So they did something that I didn't expect, which was buffing Lance. If you don't know, Lance has some of the slowest clear times for monster speedruns, and we've had to do a lot of weird sequencing and traps and bombs and scripting and all of these things to even get close to the numbers that other weapons do. All of these changes not only are helpful on their own, they're also compounding. You'll see multiple examples of that, and they'll hopefully help us get closer to the pack and stay competitive. Because unlike other blocking weapons like Sword and Shield and Charged Blade and Greatsword, when they get met by something that they can't block or they'd rather not block, they can just get out of the way. Lance doesn't have that luxury. So the first change is the one that mostly addresses that, and it's probably the most impactful, and that's damage taken while in Power Guard has been further reduced. I suspected that this was a significant damage reduction similar to Shoulder Tackle on Greatsword, and it turned out to be kind of true. You're seeing in the footage here of me fighting 9-star tempered monsters that it's taking at most 5% or so of my HP. In the previous patch, Power Guard took like 20%, 15% of my total HP per Power Guard, especially against monsters like AT Raidao and AT Uthduna. So a significant reduction. And this lets us use Power Guard more freely to then get Grand Retribution Thrust more freely, to then get Finishing Twin Thrust more freely, which also got buffed. So next up, raw damage and elemental scaling for Retribution Thrust following a Perfect Guard have been increased. This one's also very important because Retribution Thrust ended up being this red-headed stepchild in all of the finishers that really didn't do much. The Power Guard Grand Retribution turned out to be way better because you can reverse backstep into the monster, and so Retribution just kind of got you'd rather not use it, you'd rather just return thrust. And for such a cool looking move, they definitely want you to use it. So thankfully they buffed it, and I don't know if it's going to be optimal yet, but in terms of the damage and just the feel of it, it definitely does feel like it hits harder, significantly harder, and it hits more often because they also buffed the hitbox a little bit more, but we'll touch on that in a bit. Next up, the wide sweep, reverse attack, finishing thrust, finishing twin thrust, and counter rush, raw damage, and elemental scaling all got buffed. The most important ones here are finishing twin thrust. Like I mentioned previously, you get that out of both retribution thrust options. So just more damage on top of more damage, which is great. And then also wide sweep was already part of an optimal combo for when you wanted to conserve as much sharpness as possible on longer fights like TA Wiki rules or time attacks for the free challenge quests and stuff like that, where you just don't have the luxury of killing the monster in 2 minutes. Wide sweep was very useful to keep up your DPS, your uptime, while also maintaining your sharpness as high as possible. So yeah, it's also significant and it feels way better. Charge counter can now be changed into after a perfect guard or guards with minimal knockback. This is also something we've all been asking for in terms of Lance mains. Whenever you perfect guarded, the game had a tendency to love to try to give you payback thrusts whenever you did so, and it was so annoying that at that point everyone started, and you'll notice this in multiple speedrun attempts, we got to just throwing out a mid thrust to then chain into charge counter. Now we don't need to do that, and we get to just charge counter right off the bat. Obviously, throwing away mid thrust, like whiffing them to get a higher charge, is going to be useful for your charge counter, but now the fact that we can just go straight into a charge counter if we don't have the time, for example against Seregios, sometimes you have to perfect guard the first dive, and then you get to charge counter the second dive, and then you get to charge counter the first sweep, and then you have to power guard or block the fourth sweep. It gets a little bit complicated, but with this, it just lets us do charge counters more consistently out of perfect guard for defense. Next up, elemental scaling for return thrust, mid thrust, 1, 2, and 3, and triple thrust have been increased. This one's also great just because it's more damage. It's elemental. Obviously, raw is still king in this game, but elemental is good, and especially against monsters like Uthduna and Mizuzune and all of these other water monsters, it's just going to be great because obviously we have Lagiacrus now as a set bonus, and honestly, most Lance players are probably going to be running the 2-piece Lagiacrus, so great stuff there. Next up, payback thrust, grand retribution, and high thrust 1, 2, and 3 raw damage have been increased. Again, just compounding effects. I was trying payback thrust quite a lot in these clips, you'll see. I'm not quite sure if it's up to par still. It might not be. Grand retribution, of course, is very much up to par. And then high thrust 1, 2, and 3 are also very, very good. I don't think triple high thrust is still, or is going to be the meta. Maybe like mid, high, high, which we've already been doing. Just because high is a little bit slower than mids. items. Payback thrust has some use cases now that it got buffed in terms of distance traveled. I did get some clips where if I didn't have payback thrust, I wouldn't have gotten a punish in. So if you're being pushed back by the monster with perfect guards and stuff like that, payback thrust might be a good option to get back in and keep your uptime, especially if they have a long recovery afterward. But for damage, it's still not that good. And for anti-air, it's still kind of like your only option. So I guess for anti-air, it's better, I guess. Next up, the hitbox for Retribution Thrust has been enlarged. This is all versions, and it definitely feels noticeable, even though sometimes, especially against Seregios, I got it to whiff, so it's not foolproof, or at least they didn't test it for some of the power clashes we'll talk about in a little bit. But definitely noticeable in terms of like how far away you can hit something. Speaking of noticeable, extended the distance traveled when inputting a direction with leaving thrust, return thrust, and payback thrust. This is very, very noticeable. A little bit finicky though. I don't know how sometimes I didn't get distance and then sometimes I just launched 10 miles forward. It's a little bit weird. I don't know exactly how it's working or how they modeled it or if it has something to do with the focus mode. But leaping thrust, all of these things are fantastic. Payback thrust, like we talked about, very important to have a little bit of distance to it, but primarily leaping thrust because that's part of our optimal combos right now and is going to be even more useful. Next up, adjusted the transition from wide sweep into mid thrust, high thrust, and dash attack to be quicker. Interestingly here, they excluded, and something I did notice in the footage, the finishers actually. So if you're trying to use sweep on the third hit, that is going to be just as slow as it was. But if you're using the wide sweep in the middle of the combo, like we've been doing for the optimal sharpness combo, it's going to be way faster and way more convenient for you to time a sweep to like kill a little bit of time to then get a big counter thrust in or a perfect parry or whatever you want to do. So it helps a lot more with the timing. Next up, the amount of weapon sharpness consumed when performing Focus Strike Victory has been reduced. This one's great just because a Focus Strike should not be consuming that much weapon sharpness. That being said, Lance sharpness is still very much a problem, but it apparently is intentional. So there's no getting around that. We'll just keep using Razor Sharp or Master's Touch. Next up, after winning a power clash, you can now follow up with Retribution Thrust, Return Thrust, Payback Thrust, etc. This is also great. Obviously, Retribution Thrust is probably going to be the better one, but on some monsters, like I mentioned with Seregios, I did get it to whiff, so maybe Payback Thrust in some cases after a power clash will be more optimal, just to get back in there. And like I mentioned with the Retribution Thrust, you just can't reverse backstep it as well as a grand Retribution Thrust. So on some attacks, I think it might just be better to try to power guard. Now, the problem with power clashes is that not all the monsters have them, and also they're kind of a DPS loss. So this is a nice band-aid solution, but in general, and you'll notice it with some fights like AT with Duna, for example, if you look up speedruns with Lance, you're actually wanting to avoid power clashes because it's a DPS loss at the end of the day. So yeah, they have to do something with power clash to make it a little bit cooler. I still think offsets are just the superior gimmick mechanic, but you know. And then finally, some bug fixes with certain attacks hitting the opposite direction the player is facing during power guard, not correctly transitioning into stalwart guard. This is just like sometimes you didn't get the animation properly, stuff like that. And then while guarding, while moving, would not properly block attacks. Sometimes attacks would dead angle you. I guess that's a good term for it. But yeah, that's everything for Lance. It's been substantial. I mean, hopefully the clips do show just how impactful the changes have been. Now, do I think it is in a good state? I mean, I can't really tell. We'll have to see how good the times get, especially when returning to stuff like AT with Duna, which is still available, and AT Raid DAO to see if we get to shave like a minute or maybe a minute and a half, maybe two, I don't know, minutes off of those times now that we can kind of spam Power Guard and Grand Retribution Thrust. So we'll see. Now, I don't think this changes the meta for freestyle rule, speedrunning, like, you know, Corrupted Mantle and all that kind of stuff. The mid-thrust game is still the mid-thrust game, but at least high thrust will have some place once you don't have that Corrupted Mantle. And for TA Wiki rule sets, stuff like that, like restricted rule sets, this is a little bit more impactful, I think, than for freestyle. So let me know what you think about the changes if you're a Lance main. If you're not, but it got you interested in Lance, let me know how it's going. And as always, have a good one.